My first question is Tom Cruise as short as I think he is?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Not very
good to know.
friendly. He's not a really nice guy.
Oh, okay. I
But
guess it all
the
comes
thing is,
around.
everybody's short. Jeff Goldblum is the only guy who's really tall. So
Really? Oh, interesting. So,
everybody else is very small.
hello, everyone, and welcome to Field Tripping. Joining us today is Anne Philippi, founder of The New Health Club, a notable podcast and newsletter brand and space where CEOs, founders, investors, scientists, and therapists from the new psychedelic ecosystem and business can talk about the disruptive power of psychedelics, about new markets, compounds, and psychedelic medicine. She is working on bringing the New Health Club to the next level soon, and we're excited to see what that means. And thank you so much for joining us today. Are you ready to go field tripping?
I'm really ready to go field tripping, Ronan. Nice to see
All
you
right.
this
All
evening
right.
or afternoon.
Nice to see you as well. Calling in from the Soho House in London, England. Very fancy of you.
Exactly.
I don't think I've ever been in a Soho House, and I may actually take that as a point of pride. Have you been a member for a long time?
Yeah, like since 20, I think 10. And this is when the house in Berlin opened and also the one in Los Angeles. So I got every house membership. There's actually one in Toronto, so you can go right after the conversation.
It's literally around the corner from us. And much like my brother, who worked in the cannabis industry for about 4 or 5 years, but has never used cannabis, I am glad to say that I am in direct proximity to Soho House. And I can say I've never been in one. Actually, that's not true. I may have been in one when I was in Austin. But that's not why we're here today. We're here today to talk about baseball. No, I'm just kidding. For those listeners, before we started, Anne was saying she likes unexpected questions. So baseball seemed like a good unexpected question. Although, in a very positive note, I just read the other day, we're 60 days away from opening day, which I could care less about because I'm not really a baseball fan, but it does mean that spring isn't too far away. And that gives me hope. So, on that note, and you were, I think, the first person to interview me in the psychedelics space, maybe the second. And I remember doing the interview from my ping pong table in my basement because it was the very early days of the pandemic. And I appreciated your inquisitive nature and thank you for reaching out. Now, my first question to you, because I think it's important for everybody, how does a journalist, a successful journalist with a very broad career, dedicate her life to psychedelics? What was the inspiration? How did you get on this path? And yeah, how's it going in that respect?
I would say that, I spent many years in California as a Hollywood reporter. And for some reason, I thought this would be something that I would do forever, or like at least eventually also get into the screenwriting, TV show business, which I was already looking into. But then actually, I would say my personal story got in the way in terms that I felt like more and more there are really things that are not resolved in me. And I just, as a lot of people that get into psychedelics, I couldn't really tell what it is, but I felt it became stronger and stronger. And so there's this great, since we're talking about Hollywood, from quote from Drew Barrymore. It's like, guess who's getting off that plane in China? So it's still the person that you are, even if you go to China. So, and at one point, this is exactly what happened to me. I was like, I can have 5 Tom Cruise or George Clooney interviews a week, but it will not actually tell me what's really going on with me. And then many things have happened, like the whole reporting and especially celebrity reporting became kind of, I would say, a little bit obsolete because of social media. So I went back to Berlin from California, and for a year, I was really, or maybe 2 years, I was really clueless what would be the next step because I also did not want to go back to journalism. And then I realized that still the reason was still because there was something in me that I couldn't really figure out. And I think I've done 15 years of talk therapy, and then coming back to Berlin, I started the next therapy. And I was like, this time I find this super therapist. And what's really funny is I picked the therapist, a woman, because she reminded me of Asia Argento. And I was like, something is wrong with me. I just really have to get rid of this kind of, I mean, it sounds like Hollywood narrative in a way. She was the total wrong therapist for me. So I realized, no, it's not going to work for me anymore. So because I kept telling the same story since basically 15 years. And then I just really randomly met through friends a person who gave me this Michael Pollan book. And I had heard at that point about microdosing, but I mean, not really getting getting into it. And then I started to read Michael Pollan, and I read the part where he wrote about LSD, and that was it. So I was like, I want to have exactly this experience that guy had. So, and because the way he was writing about it, also because he said like he was 60 when he started this, and he was like, I was stuck in my ways, I didn't know what to do, and I was like, well, this is exactly how I feel, but I still don't know why I feel that way. So then I found a psychiatrist in Germany where it's not legal, of course, to do an LSD experience, but it was a established psychiatrist though. And then I went on really my first psychedelic experience whatsoever in Saturday morning where other people go shopping. So at 10 o'clock, I went there and took the LSD. And I had a really interesting experience, not very emotional, but very interesting, like tons of information. Then I just wrote the first story actually for a very established German newspaper like Frankfurter Allgemeine about this. And
Please don't ask me to
then
repeat the name of the journalism
no,
or
you don't have
that media
to.
outlet.
let's say it's the New York Times of Germany.
Okay, New York
So
Times and
kind of
Turner.
something
Okay.
like that. So and then afterwards, I felt like I just I got more and more into it. I just you know how it is. You start to meet more people suddenly who are doing this, or which are not that many at that time, like 2018-ish. But then something in me had really started to shift, but like slowly, not like coming out of the experience and then your life is changing. Then I had met a couple of investors who helped me to launch the podcast because they knew me as a journalist. And then in 2020, shortly before the pandemic, I went to Synthesis to do the first psilocybin trip ever. And afterwards, that was it. I was just ready to go. I had money in the bank to do the podcast. I couldn't leave my house like nobody else. So, and I just did podcast and that was it. So, but the underlying topic is really that I felt that my personal journey was just also the beginning to really find out what I was looking into. And so I kind of used my personal journey to drive the business also in a way.
Thank you for sharing that. My first question is Tom Cruise as short as I think he is?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, very
good to know.
friendly. He's not a really nice guy.
Oh, okay. I guess
But
it all
but the
comes
thing is,
around.
everybody's short. Jeff Goldblum is the only guy who's really tall. So
Really? Oh,
everybody else,
interesting.
yeah,
So
everybody else is very small.
maybe I should have been a Hollywood actor. I clearly missed my calling.
You still can do it.
It's true. It's never too late. Can I ask, maybe not in the LSD experience or maybe in the psilocybin experience, but did you start to get the answer of what was missing? I mean, I can see how the bright lights and glamour and money and all that kind of stuff around Hollywood can be very intoxicating. And then when you get there, it can probably leave a very bad taste in your mouth because it's a whole bunch of show and not a lot of substance. That's exactly what it is. But what did these experiences reveal to you about the disconnect that was happening that caused you to leave Hollywood and go back to Germany?
But I mean, I think like let's say on the surface it was like around 2013, 14, a lot of European, let's say, journalists who have been in LA for a while, they really had to face the changing industry, that you could not make money anymore with this as a journalist, as a correspondent. So this was on the surface what was happening. So like rationally, you should have said, okay, this is nothing that you should invest in with your future. But one thing I realized why I turned away from it is that I felt the longer I was there, in a weird way, the less creative I became, because I was just recording what other people were saying or answering. And sometimes you had like a round table with 5 people and one celebrity. And then you had like, you put your recording machine in the middle. And then 2 people would ask questions and the others would just record what these 2 people were asking. So you could have like a monkey put your recording machine in the middle and it would have been the same. I mean, it sounds crazy, but it would have been the same effect. Or like an AI device just recording and no human being necessary. The high point was reached in the Judd Apatow interview for Netflix with 20 people in a room. And there was a table and there was a really sign saying, talent, introduce yourself. It was such a low point. And Judd Apatow came in and was like, okay, my name is Judd Apatow. I'm a director. And I was like, oh no, it was just horrible. Everything started to be horrible. Kind of like when you left situations, or when I left situations like that, being in a hotel in San Bernardino for hours with tons of people, and Judd Apatow had to introduce himself, although he was the biggest celebrity and the most interesting director. And I start to feel like my body started to feel exhausted, although it was supposed to be really fun, kind of. And I just only really came back to life when there were situations and interviews where people didn't say things they were supposed to say. For example, Kevin Spacey was very good at that. But I felt like in me something was absolutely kind of, I'm not going to say falling apart, but I felt that this personal story or issue, whatever you want to call it, was kind of knocking on the door to be resolved. And as you know, when you live in LA, you do like yoga every day, like Kundalini yoga, which is very psychedelic actually, which nobody told you. And I had a couple of sessions that were very intense, but I had no idea that that was already like through the breath work, which also that expression, nobody used that expression, but it was actually breath work. So afterwards, I thought, oh, I'm going to yoga and then I'm going to do these interviews. And I felt like high in interviews. And I was like, I just did yoga. So it was like everything was too much. Things came out that you couldn't handle anymore. So I felt like the more spiritual language one was using, like so-called spiritual language or consciousness language, the less secure I felt. It was a weird combination of like an overdose of this California bubble, which I mean, I love California, but it's just you need like some other influences once in a while. So, and I think that was the moment when I felt like I'm just supposedly should look into my psyche or my health, but I'm actually moving away from it. And I think this happened to a lot of people who really try to chase something there that they couldn't even tell what it is.
And is that what came out during the LSD experience? Like, did you have that
No, actually,
awareness while
not
you're
at
going through?
all.
Okay.
I mean, it was interesting that right after, in 5 minutes in the trip, there was no information about this, let's say, life that I had left behind. It was actually the opposite. It was the life that I had never, um, acknowledged. So there came a lot of scenes in the beginning were playing out in the scenario like it must have been like a post-war Germany, or like roughly a couple of years, like months after the war, because the first thing I saw was my parent, my mother and my grandparents holding hands in front of a destroyed Germany and saying to me like, we have so much problems in our family, but they are not yours. So I got like totally back in time, nothing to do with any kind of Hollywood questioning. And also I was pregnant with twins for 6 hours in the trip. I was looking into World War II and my family's problems after the war. I was married to a Jewish husband. I was like, everything was topics came up, like ideas, pictures, feelings that, I mean, obviously I had never experienced ever in like normal therapy. And especially the pregnancy thing was very interesting, because one thing in Los Angeles was like, I always asked myself, or started to ask myself, why I wouldn't have children, but I could never really answer it. So I was never like saying, oh, I never want to have kids and I'm determined. So, but I also couldn't say why I wouldn't have them. And of course, like so many other people later, I found out because it was of a childhood trauma experience, but it was the first time I ever had like a very fast answer to a question, which is like, oh, if you're like pregnant with twins, it seems to mean something to you. So, and that was just very different information than any therapy has ever given to me. And in fact, actually, all the talk therapy was always like the opposite of the information I got in a psychedelic experience. So, and that was really significant, right from the beginning.
Can you expand on that? How was it the opposite?
Well, for example, I give an example. Like I had this therapist, the last therapist that looked like the actress. So she said to me like, "Oh yeah, but it can also be really cool to not have children." She, of course, had children and a really nice husband and a house. Like, like all of this that was so cool not to have, but she had it. And then she was like, "Wow, there are women who think it's really cool." And I was like, "Well, but I'm not one of these women. I don't think it's cool. So what does it even mean then?" And so she basically tried to tell me that it's cool to not have that. So, but I wanted it to have for a long time, kind of, obviously. So, and then in the trip, I obviously got the answer, well, this is something that means a lot to you. So, and so you just didn't do it for whatever reason. And then I found out this reason in a couple of other trips, but it was very clear that the topic was very, very important to me. So it's like a total contradiction between these kinds of therapies, kind of.
Thank you for sharing that. That's very personal. So you have this LSD experience. You write the article that gets published in the New York Times for Germany. And were you like, all right, this is my path, or was it kind of like, oh, there seems to be an opportunity here. Why don't I do this while I figure everything else out?
Not really. I mean, it was, and I'm almost like happy that it wasn't this one trip and then it's like a life-changing thing and you move to a different country and it was really incredible to have these where did this information came from? There was something I thought about for the 3 months afterwards. Of course, I had a little bit of an integration, but not enough. But so still, it was something that was so like almost the reality would be I would be the opposite of the person that I thought I would be in the last, I don't know, years. Then it took a while, but even in that while, I never thought, oh, if somebody would have offered me like another job at Vanity Fair, I would have taken it. But the real, let's say, the most important moment came really after psilocybin. So like I think LSD was like you're driving in a very fast car and you see lots of things and it's super cool. But the emotional thing came with psilocybin. It's really interesting. It started with I mean, as you know, one remembers it often very well. So it started with me like closing my eyes and I saw a couple of rabbis and they said to me, you know why you live in that street that you live in? Because this is where we lived. So and one of them then in the trip, he took me to Auschwitz. So we were walking, we were just walking, walk and talk, you could say. So he said to me like, well, I mean, I'm just saying what he said. I'm not making it up. So he said to me, well, we need basically people like you to help us to develop a new idea of Judaism again that has nothing to do with the Holocaust anymore. And we help you with your business for that. I know it's hard. I mean, I can say it on a psychedelic podcast. People won't think I'm crazy. It was a very interesting conversation that really showed me that I had a lot of Jewish friends who were always telling me, well, we can help you with this. Like, let me know. Like, I can introduce you to this or that person. So I never really had thought of already like a strong community. I had already in this, let's say, kind of, how you want to say, this cultural group of people in Germany, which now becomes a little more visible again after the last 20 years, I would say. And so it brought me into a completely new way of thinking about building a business with a community, for example, and not just creating something like an article and sending it somewhere to some editor, but just where are your people? How can these people help you? How can you support each other mutually? So, and then out of this experience came a really strong community sense, which I had not had as a journalist, because journalists hate each other and are always super competitive and are not friendly to each other and don't help each other. So this is just the way it is. They're very critical. Nobody likes them. It's really so, and then there was the opposite of this kind of super competition world. So, and suddenly there was this world of, here is a group of people, and they might be different, these people, but together they can build something. So, and after this, after 2 days later, I went to Germany, to south of Germany, to meet David Bronner for a podcast. And we talked about him being at the first time at his in the German city called Heilbronn, where half of his family came from, who died in the Holocaust. We talked about exactly this topic. So, and then they came on as a sponsor for the podcast 2 months later. So it was a very interesting journey after this to create also a whole new idea around business. So, and after this, I was like, okay, this is where I would like to be, in this kind of energy, and not like kind of being super competitive 24 hours and burned out and just lying to get a better story and stuff. So, and then after this, I didn't want to go back.
Being hyper competitive to get a story from an asshole like Tom Cruise, I can see how one is definitely more appealing than the other, and when you put it that way.
Well, I mean, in his case, it's kind of, you would be even like threatened by Scientology. So, that's
true.
Which is actually true.
I should clarify. Are you Jewish by background, or does just Jewish themes show up in your experiences quite a bit?
But I mean, okay, it's still something I cannot really tell. I still have to do this Me 23 thing. But I just know that my parents almost moved to Israel and worked in a kibbutz. And when they announced to do that, I was like, oh God, this is like my dream. I don't know why. I didn't even know why. So I just wanted to go. But then we didn't go, and it's, I don't know, still not really resolved, the topic.
Well, again, thank you for sharing those personal details. So you get this feedback of, oh, you should do something. You should do more work in kind of reporting or communicating around psychedelics. At what point was the New Health Club born, and what was the inspiration for the name, and what was your vision for it? Or was it more of a, let's see what happens, and if it goes somewhere, it goes somewhere, and if it doesn't, that's okay too?
No, it was very, I mean, the name came, actually, we had an event in October 2019, like a little talk, you could say, with Christian Angermeyer. So we invited a couple of people. It turned out 40 people came to this talk. We thought, okay, we have like a half an hour conversation and then like a drinks or something. And it was a 3-hour conversation. People were nonstop asking questions. So the need for information and questions was huge. And so we called it like the New Health Society. And then I was like, oh, society is always it's so heavy, kind of. And then I was like, oh, club, like everybody wants to be in a club. And then we just called it the New Health Club and sent out emails. So would you be interested in something like this again? And then we got, again, like huge feedback. And then, of course, COVID came. But the idea for the podcast also, and to have this specific kind of addressing people who were actually super interested in this, was like I found there was either like a communication or a few podcasts around that were extremely spiritual, which I kind of took a step away from after living in California, because I felt that for some people it makes them even feel worse because they can't really say what that means. If you're, let's say, have this bumper sticker on your mirror in the morning, be conscious, so like this constant vocabulary of being conscious. So, and the other thing at the same time, the other communication or sometimes even podcasts were very medical. So, and that was also something that most people couldn't not really relate to. Also, although it might have been interesting, but it wasn't just their world. So, and I felt right from the beginning there was a huge need to kind of address, to almost like create a new language around psychedelics, or like conversations about psychedelics. A lot of these conversations and questions actually became then very thorough and deep, because people started to talk about their personal experiences. Like, I think one of the first podcasts, because of Dr. Bronner's, was Rick Doblin, and then he talked about his experiences with Stan Grof in Esalen, and how they did ketamine and how they saw Hitler. And I was like, what? Like, how can he even tell me this? But there was so much energy coming out of these, like being really open about things, and also about the mistakes they had made maybe in their company building or in their kind of journey to where they are now. So, and I think out of this developed, how could you even describe this? Like a modern language that people feel comfortable to be addressed in, and also are able to ask questions that are not like, oh, that's a really dumb question. So there were no dumb questions, actually. I think that was the secret, maybe a secret sauce.
Yeah, I can see that being relevant, especially for people who are just starting to explore. There's a nomenclature, there's a culture, there's a whole bunch of stuff around psychedelics. It's, as you point out, either very medical or very spiritual, and that alienates a lot of people, or maybe not alienates, but
Yeah,
excludes
yeah,
a lot of people. So
yeah.
trying to normalize that conversation, I think, is critical. So you started with the podcast, and how are things going now? Tell us about what's going on with the new health club and your vision for it.
Yeah, so I mean, then especially since the podcast, even like, especially of course in the time of the lockdown, this is when it started, that a lot of people started to really get in touch and say, like, where can I even go to do this? Where is it okay? What should I pay attention to? And so this was the first step that we kind of saw there was a need for people to really have information, and maybe even recommendations, like we did. So, but then I think the latest development is a little bit that you can feel that people, or let's say future customers or people who are starting to be interested in this for many different reasons, that it's a really good way to address people more based on, let's say, the context that they're in and why they would like to look in this. For example, the most simple example that already exists is partly like a leadership retreat or a women's retreat. But even that now is a little bit like becoming more specific, because women is like, you know what? So is it like for women who maybe have experienced some sexual trauma? Is it for women who are looking into a new phase of their life, like kind of after midlife? So I think things starting to become now a little bit more customized. And one of the great things that we're just working on is with Yuri Blokhin from Homecoming. It's also, I think they're also in Toronto. And so he's one of the founders of the Ukrainian Psychedelic Association. And so I think they're looking into, in the long term, to implement psychedelic assisted therapy right into the government or in healthcare once the war is hopefully over soon. So we actually looking into creating a specific retreat together with him for Ukrainians who had to or want to leave their country. I mean, there's still a lot of people in the Ukraine, but people who are outside the country but are suffering from their, I mean, either from the war trauma in the first couple of months they were there, or their family is still there. So they would have the chance already to go to a retreat and look into this. Or, for example, we had a couple of in Germany, a couple of Iranian women approaching us and saying like, well, our family is in Iran, but we have no idea what's going on with them. So, but we're losing our shit here although we are in Germany, although we are not actually in the country, but we are so affected by this incredible situation that we would like to look into psychedelic therapy or like experience to kind of deal with that. So kind of topics like that are becoming interesting in terms of creating content around this, that people actually even are able to know, oh, there's even a chance for me that I could look into this if I'm suffering from this. And the Iranian thing is, of course, also interesting because there's also a whole generation of people who has even if they haven't experienced it by themselves, but their parents have left Iran in 1979. So the whole revolution thing is kind of an epigenetic situation that is coming back now into their consciousness with the current situation. So all of these kind of new, let's say, contexts that are emerging in the last years, I would say, this is what we kind of trying to take on in terms of podcast content, but also then connecting it to an actual retreat. So, and that's something we're just looking into how this could look like as a structure. So, because I really think in the end, you really want to create something like that you actually, that you really can offer, and not just like talking about it all the time, like how it has to happen and when it has to happen. So, because you can do it already if you put things together. So
cool. So beyond the podcast, you're now kind of organizing retreats around specific themes, whether it's, survivors of Ukraine or survivors of Iran or any other kind of very maybe niche themes, which I think is fantastic. I think it's really important. There's a lot of talk, and I think it's important in the psychedelic space about, your natural healing intelligence and all that kind of stuff, and going into these experiences and letting what comes up come up, which is great. But I do think there's probably currently underserved role for kind of guided, constructive, targeted conversations, and especially with shared experiences. I think it's really powerful and really beautiful. And maybe you should take it down to Israel and do it on a kibbutz, because clearly something in your genetics is calling you to go down there, right? Now,
maybe we open like a psychedelic kibbutz. Who knows?
Hey, now you're thinking. Now you're thinking.
You're gonna be there.
I'm sure I will be there kibbutzing away.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. But what about you? I mean, do you think about this a lot? Like, do you, in your experiences, I mean, you are Jewish, right? So in your experiences, is this like a theme, like probably is, of course, but how does this play out in your experiences?
Being Jewish?
Yeah.
Still to come out. Thank you for asking. It's never been about specifically being Jewish, but I think there's a lot of cultural traits that have come up for me and continue to come up, particularly around my grandfather. My grandfather was extremely wealthy business owner, had the whole world before him kind of thing, and turned into a curmudgeonly, miserly old man. And I think a lot of those themes and the things he struggled with probably are culturally identified, in terms of a lot of Jewish culture aspects, but I've never specifically teased it out being like, oh, this is a Jewish thing. It's more like, that's my grandfather thing, or that's my dad thing, or that's my mom thing. But I think if you went through a lot of Jewish families, you'd hear similar kind of themes percolating up. So yeah, that's kind of my perspective. So far in my work with psychedelics, what I found is simply the group experience to be the most important part. It didn't necessarily, it wasn't the theme, but the shared nature of the experience, and the vulnerability, and the almost imprinting that happens when you're in that state, that matters most. And so, not that it was a Jewish thing, or, a women's thing, not that I'd necessarily go to a women's thing, but it's just the shared experience from different perspectives, and in the moment. But I got a long road ahead, hopefully. So more details to come in that respect. I do find it interesting, though, that, and I'm curious to know your perspectives, because for everybody out there, if you remember the show, Everybody Loves Raymond, even though I hated the show, I love the title. And I feel like in the psychedelic space, we live in a world where everyone loves Anne, because Anne is everywhere, and Anne is embraced everywhere in the space. Everywhere I go, you're there, and beyond, which is wonderful. And so I think you
Where's
get like
beyond exactly?
well, like ICPR, you're at a whole bunch of conferences
Okay.
that I've never heard of. So, although I have heard of ICPR.
Okay.
And so I think I think you have a very unique perspective, because you're coming at it. You are now a business person, but you're never going to give up that lens of being a journalist and just being observant about what happens. And so I guess my first question is, how do you see things evolving differently in the psychedelic space in Europe versus North America? I find it very interesting, at least on a cultural level, that Germany is a hotbed for the psychedelic movement. Christian and Lars and Florian and Natai and Compass, a lot of that is born out of Germany, which is a culture that, if you said pick any culture in the world that would be a hotbed for psychedelic activity, Germany would probably be number 3 or 4 on the most unlikely, just in terms of gross generalizations. But it doesn't seem to fit culturally. So I guess there's 2 questions in there, which is, first is, do you think there's a reason it's happening in Germany in particular? And secondly, how do you see it evolving differently in Europe versus North America?
I mean, that's an interesting question with Germany, because I feel like the need for, I'm going to just say, like, I think the need for healing is a very big one, and it's kind of coming out now. So, because I remember, like, let's say, I mean, obviously because of the whole Nazi time, but even before the Nazis, there was a very heavy history in Germany. And I remember, like, the great psychiatrist, the Hans von Wechem, like, who was also at Field Trip, and he said to me, whenever he had German clients coming in, like 90% of these clients had at one point in the trip a very heavy and, like, really strong kind of heaviness around them that they needed to kind of leave behind them. And I think that this is really one of the reasons why Germany has this need and interest. I mean, it's really like a lot of German people getting in touch and saying, like, I want to go to Amsterdam. Yeah, what should I do? What should I pay attention to? And not a single Italian person so far. And then also no French people, because they would be really, I'm not saying how I feel, period. So, but Germans really are really looking into this now. So, and microdosing, it's all over Berlin. Like, German television has now, like, almost like you feel like every 2 or 3 weeks there's something about psychedelics now, ketamine. Like, it's really out there right now. And I think it must have something to do with that, because it's really not enough anymore to just say, oh, Auschwitz was liberated on January 27th. Great. So let's move on. So something is kind of coming to the surface. And I know it's still hard to say this or talk about this in a way that people would say, like, yeah, but that's all kind of bullshit. But just listen to Gabo Mate and you will understand what I'm talking about, because he can explain it much better than I do. But so the way he talks about it, I mean, this is exactly, I think, what is happening right now. How people start to, especially Germans, start to feel this past in them in one way or the other. And in Europe, second part of your question, how is this different in Europe? I think what's interesting, you can see now in very different European countries, like obviously England, let's say it's Europe, like England, Germany, Switzerland, the whole like Scandinavian area, like Sweden, Denmark, even Oslo, has really a very, very interesting and kind of recently accelerating psychedelic scene, or like even research scene. So like you mentioned ICPR, and this is like the, let's say, the European Horizons Conference. It's a rather on the science side, or not so much on the, let's say, business side. And I mean, I was there the first time also, like I was last year, and it's really interesting how every country now kind of starts to contribute to this kind of overall general idea that in Europe you should be able to have psychedelic therapy. And in Germany, it's really interesting also that, let's say, a lot of people ask me recently about like, yeah, I heard about this ketamine, where can I do it? And let's say if you Google ketamine Frankfurt, you would have 5 doctors. Ketamine Hamburg, 5 doctors. But nobody really knows about it. So, but it is there. So, and I think one of the things in Europe is that, I mean, America has, of course, already like way more media and way more articles about it. But I think Europe is still in need of more communication about it outside of the scientific sector. And coming quickly back to Soho House, because we started in, was it January? We started at the Berlin Soho House like a monthly psychedelic conversation, coming from very different angles. Like in January, we had Patrick Cox as a guest, who was Canadian of Toronto, a really famous shoe designer who got into 5-MeO-DMT and helped himself to not kill himself. I mean, what he says. And so we had like 100 people coming to this event, just wanting to know about the toad, which Patrick knows very well to talk about. And and it's really interesting that these live, now that we're coming back to live events, or to people really coming physically into a place, you can see that so many people in Europe are really, really starting to, for many different reasons, to really want to look into this. And our first event outside of Berlin is on February 28th in Paris. The first event in Paris about psychedelics. So, in the new kind of the third wave, basically.
Do you feel like a palpable difference between what's happening in North America and Europe? Is it still kind of a little bit more hush hush in Europe, even though it's percolating up? Is it just more open, overt in North America, or is it kind of just the same thing?
It's not the same thing. I would say in America, it's already like, it's kind of done in a way. Like it's just a matter of, I don't know, maybe a year or something. And I think in Europe, it's still, people are really still want to know about the research. Like if you say, for example, Charité in Berlin is doing it, and in England, Imperial College. So then this is still kind of something that people need to hear at least once, that there's a kind of a science background. But the interesting thing, what I observed in the last 2 years in Germany, is that Germans are very hands-on with growing their own mushrooms. So, and they don't even like, oh, I mean, of course, always the question is, can I buy it in Amsterdam? So yeah, but then you would have to take it, outside of Amsterdam, of the Netherlands, which would make it illegal. So there's this new wave of taking your mental health care into your own hands if the state is too slow. And I think there's also a younger generation who will not look into SSRIs anymore if they can try first to do microdosing. That's totally my observation. That's what's happening.
I hear that. You are, a recognized female voice in the psychedelic space. How do you see the sort of gender divide? It still feels like a fairly, truthfully, white male dominated industry. And I'm just wondering, and I know you've been on a couple of panels recently, notionally about women and psychedelics.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have any perspectives on that.
Well, I mean, the good thing is I'm used to being in these conferences with 20 guys talking a long time. If you worked at a magazine or a newspaper, that was the go-to situation. And probably this is different now. I mean, hopefully. But I mean, it's kind of an interesting question because, of course, you want to be on a podcast like Women in Psychedelics, and there's also a great community aspect to it. Like, I also don't want to focus too much on this because I would like to talk about psychedelics and not about women in psychedelics, which is totally fine if somebody does it. But I mean, it's just that I'm more interested in molecules than in questions of feminism sometimes. And I would like to have the freedom not to only look into the female topics, the so-called whatever that is, nobody really can say it sometimes even. But what I find very interesting is that, and that's something I'm really more and more interested in, is that the perception of the female body is like changing a lot in the way that scientists start to look into that substances or treatments are different in a female body than in a male body. So, which is also something that was never on the table. So this topic I find super interesting. And it was just in the Atlantic was an article about from a journalist, a female journalist, writing like how her gynecologist was always telling her like weird stuff about her body, and she suddenly started to realize, oh my God, this really impacted me for so long, something like that. And I think that goop has a lot. I mean, I know a lot of people are not in favor of Gwyneth Paltrow, but if you look back on it, this is specifically this idea has been really launched at Goop, and it came really to me often because of their articles or podcasts, that there was actually way more to it than just going to a doctor and everybody would be treated in the same way. So, but no, but women have obviously not the same body like men, but they were treated like that. And out of this came a couple of traumatizing experiences. And also in terms of like sexual abuse and what this has actually to, yeah, I mean, how the perception of this has to change if somebody maybe goes through this, or a woman goes through this with the support of psychedelic therapy and finds out, okay, she has that experience. And then who is her sexuality after she has looked into her trauma? So this is something that's becoming super interesting for me from a perspective of a woman. But I think this whole thing, like, so in Germany, you always have this, okay, if you're a female founder, this is only the only thing you're going to ever talk about for the rest of your life, about being a female founder. So, but you also want to talk about psychedelics. So it's kind of sometimes a little bit of a weird situation to be in, but I have to say, I feel the best if I don't have to talk about being a female founder, podcaster, da 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 da. So that's when I feel best, actually, to be honest.
I'm obviously not in a woman's shoes, although I could wear pumps to work, I suppose. But I can totally resonate that with that, which is you just want to be treated on the level. But there's also an emphasis right now and trying to recalibrate, I guess, gender roles, and particularly in business and all that kind of stuff. So, I can appreciate the complexity around it.
I mean, I think it's also maybe a generational thing because I think like journalism is also not a very female kind of business. And like the big journalist names are hardly ever female. Like this, like Christiane Amanpour, people like her, that's super rare that somebody's that famous. It's mostly men. So, but I mean, oh, yeah, and it's true. I mean, I don't come from a generation where you necessarily had a lot of time to think about these things. You just had to be faster, like we said earlier, meaner, more
Yeah.
competitive. It's not always something bad. There were moments where it actually was also great. So I'm not saying, oh, this is always, but it's kind of a very difficult, or let's say it's not such an easy topic as we think it sometimes is. That's what I mean.
That's fair. I take that point. As you were talking about being a woman in psychedelics, you said you'd rather focus on the compounds. And I find that choice of word interesting because in my mind, the word compound immediately puts it into a clinical kind of context. But there's a whole cultural context about what's happening right now. And the whole conversation, at least in the business of psychedelics, is still very much grounded in the medical. Like people are afraid to talk about the fact that there may be a cultural component to this. I'm wondering what your perspective is on that.
Do you mean like how it's the best thing to be perceived, or like?
I mean more that in addition to all the excitement about treating treatment resistant depression and postpartum depression and all that kind of stuff in psychedelics, there's a lot of people doing psychedelics, recreationally or at least intentionally, but not with like a medical purview to it. And I personally believe that, just like medical cannabis was the impetus for the cannabis industry, recreational or at least intentional use cannabis is a much bigger deal and will be for the foreseeable future because that's just where it is. And I kind of feel like the cultural, the people microdosing, the people going to underground guides is going to be a much more impactful effect on our society and our world than the excitement around treating mental health conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And my feeling is always that, or my observation is, once people have had a couple of experiences in a very safe setting with a guide, they kind of are a little more self-conscious to maybe also look into other, maybe like more experimental or experiential experiences, like, I mean, Burning Man, for example. And I have to say, like, I think it was at the Miami conference, there was a party, and we were a couple of people, and we took like a little dose of something. And I was always super scared to do that back then, before I had addressed my traumatizing elements, let's say. And it was, for me, it was a very specific night because I was just really almost like redefining my idea around going out together as a group in a nightlife situation, or in a celebration, you could say, that was no longer connected to people being super drunk or aggressive, or like something weird has happened, but just really to develop a whole new idea around the music, and also around like just being there as a group and as a, yeah, again, like a community. And it was not obviously in a medical context or in a strict context. And that night was like, I keep thinking about it many times, because I was like, something has been redefined for me at this night, in this night. And I mean, I had like, for a long time, I mean, going out in Berlin meant like most people would be on cocaine and alcohol, and it was, everything was over the top. And like the week after, you couldn't call anybody because people were super depressed because they had done so much cocaine. So it was always like, it was always horrible. It was kind of, let's say, destructive. It was, nothing ever great came out of this but divorces and addictions. So, and so, but this night was very different, but it still was a nightlife situation. And I think I was able to enjoy this with this group, this small dose, because I had already had a couple of safe experiences, and I knew, okay, so this is roughly how this will feel, maybe a little different. And I think, like, I'm pretty sure there will be a point when people have looked into these things and just maybe are more open to have, I mean, let's say, and I remember like writing this story in 2016 about the new luxury cannabis industry for the German New York Times also. And it was interesting that the competition of all of these luxury cannabis companies was not other cannabis companies, but it was the glass of wine that they were competing with. And so, and I think it's a similar thing, that let's say you have a birthday, or there was even this story in the British newspaper on the microdosing wedding. So it's just, instead of alcohol, people will maybe looking or will start to look into other substances in a very small dose, but not just to go super crazy, but just to maybe enhance their community aspect or their belonging or something. So I think this is very realistic to me that this will happen.
Yeah, I agree. On the note of cannabis, you recently tweeted that you had your first cannabis retreat at Dimensions, which is in Muskoka in Ontario. Describe how a cannabis retreat is different than a psychedelic retreat beyond, actually, well, I won't make the stereotypical Doritos joke here. I'll keep that to myself.
The what? What joke?
The stereotypical Doritos and junk food kind of munchies joke.
The munchie thing. Okay. No, I didn't. No, I mean, it was very interesting because I'm not really a big cannabis person, and just also maybe because out of fear and like, but I was never really didn't have a lot of experiences. And edibles I couldn't eat. It took me 3 days to get back to normal. So I kind of stayed away from it for a while, for a long time. And but this experience was very interesting for two reasons. Because, like, first of all, I never had a ceremony with cannabis, and it was, of course, like a more softer, like not like a hitting on your head, full on psilocybin trip or 5-MeO trip. So, and it was just like 3 hours of a psychedelic experience, but not strong. And I thought, like, wow, one thing is great about this. The one thing is great, or two things are great. The first thing is that I can see that people who are wanting to look into psychedelics could actually have this experience and just have a little bit of a, like, tipping their toe into the water moment where they feel, oh, this is how this could roughly be like. But also and that in my case, that was something that I also didn't expect. So, and in July last year, I had a very high dose of psilocybin in the study context of the Maryland University study for psychedelic leadership. And so, and I was still processing a lot of things. And it was the experience was good for me, but afterwards I had a rough 2 months, I would say. And then I went into this cannabis retreat, and I felt it was a very interesting, very soft way of kind of, let's say, enhancing my integration with topics that had come up in this really big trip, completely unexpected. And the day after the cannabis thing, there was like a day of like Reiki sessions and more kind of body work, but kind of soft actually. And then I had this one Reiki session, and in this session, although it wasn't in the trip, but in this session, I had a lot of anxiety coming out that was kind of evaporating my body suddenly. And it's almost like there's somebody has to take the trash out kind of moment. But I was like, wow, this is not happening in the trip. But afterwards, after my body has been able to release some things. And so, and I also learned there how much the storage of trauma in your body is actually still very much there. Although you have done a very high dose of psilocybin, there's still points in your body where it's like where you feel something where it's gonna come out in a strange way. It was a really interesting experience also because it wasn't so strong. It was just like a gentle integration support almost. So, or if you would never have done it, you would say, okay, wow, this is, yeah, okay, next time, if this is stronger, I kind of know what it could be. So, because I mean, as you know, like a lot of people, when they do psilocybin the first time, I mean, it is a very strong experience. And most people have never had that experience. So this was it was really unexpected. But and the main takeaway was really how this somatic kind of integration is a very, very supportive thing for once you enter your journey, your bigger journey.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I had a little bit of a hard time wrapping my head around is the somatic aspect of it. It seemed too woo woo to me, but it's real.
Yeah,
Like
I
when you
know, but
experience it, it's real.
yeah, I mean, it's if somebody would tell me, I mean, and I know what you mean. You could say like, oh yeah, okay, then you went into nature, but the experience was I was really like in the middle of this Reiki thing, I had a very ancestral moment with my two grandfathers, like very real. And they said to me, like, well, so they were both in the war. They were both working in a mine afterwards because that's the only job that was there. So they had really hard lives and lives with a lot of anxiety around them. And then they said to me, like, well, we were in the war and we had anxiety. And then we went into this work and then we had another sort of anxiety. But you shouldn't have this. You should not exist. You should live. That's what they told me. And then I really had this moment, like I was super anxious for like 2 minutes and then it went away. So, and I was not while I was on psychedelics, it was just the day after.
That's, I think, a beautiful story to end on. So I do have 1.5 questions remaining, which is if people want to check out the New Health Club, how do they do so? And who has been the most interesting guest on the New Health Club? If you're going to point to one episode where people would start, other than yours truly, clearly, which episode would you point to?
I want to say Gabo Mate because I mean, it is just, to me, it is the most important person in this whole world of looking into not only psychedelics, but also how trauma works. And yeah, it is the most important episode, I think. And it was the episode I was waiting for almost a year to do because, as you know, he's very busy. Then it was the day when my camera broke. so I could see him, but he couldn't see me, which was
Okay.
maybe good because I was super nervous. But it was really like, and most people really said to me, well, after listening to this episode where he explained how trauma actually shows in people's lives without being like, extremely like visible, but how we can imagine it actually, how it will look like. So, and I think the feedback to this episode was really, really strong. So, but I before we go, I would like to know who is for you one of the most influential people. Maybe not necessarily with people with companies, but more people who have like the meta topic who define this. Like kind of, I would be interested. Who do you like?
I would say the person on the podcast who has hit the most chords or struck the most chords with me and really challenged my thinking was Jamie Wheel, the author of
Oh
Stealing
yeah,
Fire
okay,
and
yeah, yeah.
Recapture the Rapture. I mean, I'm not the smartest person in the room. I'm not a dummy either, and I was struggling to keep up with his thoughts, his reasoning, his
Me too.
rationale. And I was like, so fascinating, but it was so powerful. And I think he's onto something. I think, he has he's right on a lot of things. And I love how he kind of sums it up and puts it in a nice bow tie about here's how, you hit ecstatic states. Here's how you think about rebuilding communities and all of this kind of stuff. So that was definitely one of that's really driven a lot of my thinking and piqued my curiosity quite a bit.
Yeah, it's and he said he had COVID while we did the podcast. I was like, this is impossible. Like you can
Yeah. If you've
what is
got
it?
brain
How
fog
is it
right
if you
now,
don't have
Jesus.
COVID? No, but I mean, of course I was very like, oh God, he's coming on a podcast. And I was really, he's really, like you say, he's really something and I really admire him. But it's also something I learned in journalism that I kind of sometimes am more in awe of people who really try to actually build something, even if it's not going to work out or it's going to be super difficult. So I think this is the real thing that people actually really get kind of into the dirt and try to figure things out. So, and as much as I enjoy like great, thinkers, and of course I really like Stealing Fire. I think I read it many times. But it's also important to have people like Rick Doblin who say, like, well, we did that mistake, we did this mistake, but he still will be in Berlin at a dinner that we hosted for him, and like at 4 a.m. he will go to the Holocaust kind of Jewish area and smoke pot and connect to his ancestors. So, and to me, this is something that is like, to me, is the George Clooney of psychedelics, to be honest. if we want to come back to our narrative. So, because it's like, this is exactly what I find fascinating. If people really keep going, or Amanda Fielding, who, by the way, turns 80 today as we speak, not far from me here in London. So, and I think what she's done in all these years when people were like, oh, this crazy person from Oxford. And so this is something that's what I really admire. If people really, really know, okay, it might take, I mean, in their case, 30, 40 years until something like this is happening, what's happening now. But I think we need both also, like people like Jamie Wheel and people like Rick Doblin. So, and Amanda, of course.
Of course, yeah. No, Rick and Amanda are special human beings. I'm starting a campaign to get Rick as the Time Person of the Year. Maybe next year I may have to take another year, but it's going to be monumental. And he's such a special character, and he's so just Rick. You know, you get what you get, and he's completely unapologetic about it until he's wrong, and then he's completely apologetic about it, and he's just a real human being.
I think this is the kind of energy that will bring everything forward also, I think.
I agree with you.
So,
And that is a perfect note to end on. So, Anne,
okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for making your time. Thank you for staying up late in the UK. I guess it's not that late yet.
9:30 now in the UK. So it's okay.
And thank you for accommodating all of the reschedules. I'm glad we finally pulled this together. It's been really nice to be able to reciprocate the favor to have you on field tripping. I'm sorry that all of our ambitions for doing cool things in the Netherlands didn't quite pan out, at least yet. But one day, I'm sure we'll keep crossing paths.